The last hours before the dead came were lived in a silence that had weight. Wind ran through the bare branches of the godswood and scraped along the stone, and the snow that fell did not whisper so much as it hissed, slipping along the banners that hung damp and dark from the battlements. Under that sky, slate-toned and swollen with more storm, Winterfell bristled with torches and quiet hands. The smell of pitch and horse, of oiled leather and old wood smoke, clung in the courtyards like something alive. Men and women spoke in low voices and moved as if their steps might break the world's balance. Far beyond the walls, the fields were white and flat and fathomless, and in that white sea men and women had hammered stakes into the earth until their hands bled and their breath smoked in steady clouds. Jon Snow stood at the parapet and watched the dark beyond the fire lines, the way a man watches a door he knows must open. Longclaw hung at his side, a cold weight against his leg even through the leather and fur. He drew a breath so deep it stung and watched it leave him. It felt like treason to breathe when others were holding theirs. "The tunnels are sealed," Ser Davos said at his elbow. He had a lantern in one hand, held low so it lit their faces from beneath and made hollows of their cheeks. "Stone and timber. If their dead find the old ways under the walls, they'll find this lot waiting." He hooked a thumb toward where the ground fell away. "Out there, not in our bones." Jon nodded. He had argued for days to turn years of northern habit on its head. In every winter of memory the crypts had been a refuge, not a trap. Women and children had been ushered down with candles and blankets, food and songs. Stone lords watched in the dark and in impassive courtesy sheltered the living, and that had been the end of it. But this winter had no end that men could name. Bricks did not respect themselves when woken by a blue eye and a dead will. So the crypt doors were barred from the inside, then walled from the outside, and the halls beyond were filled with oiled sacks and sheaves of dragonglass shards bound to ropes and set on swaying arms. If the dead went down there, they would be ground and burned. If the living went down there, they would not come up again. "It isn't a small thing to deny the old ways," Ser Davos had said when Jon told him. The wind had been harsher then, and the light had been thinner, and Jon had stared at the black mouth of the stairs that led into the stark hearts below the earth. "The dead have no respect for small things," Jon had answered, and his own voice had sounded unlike itself. Now, on the wall, he turned and looked toward the winter town where so many had once lived and now only shapes moved in the streets. They had built rings there, a roped circle, then a trench, then a scatter of stakes topped with jagged obsidian. Braziers shone like islands. The old glass gardens steamed under their cracked panes, turned into a glowing city in miniature, and within them the civilians waited with hot stones in their hands and the smell of earth in their noses. Children pressed their faces to the fogged glass and watched the great shapes of dragons thrash the sky. Some wept, quietly, in that way that leaves no sound and too much salt, and some had fallen asleep against their mother's shawls, when sleep made sense to no one. Sansa Stark had arranged it all and had done it with a jaw set like steel. She came to Jon now, the hem of her cloak crusted in frost. She had her hair pinned, and her cheeks were red from the wind. Behind her, Tyrion Lannister walked with his hands clasped behind his back to keep them from the flask he had sworn to leave alone. He looked smaller than usual in the great coat he wore, and that made the scars on his face look larger and whiter. "I've placed the cooks and the older men with spears along the inner ring," Sansa said without greeting. She had long ago given up wasting words on preambles. "If they break our outer defenses, and I know you all insist they will not, but I am not Dothraki and will not pretend, then anyone who runs from the winter town will have to come through too much fire and too much glass. They'll be slowed. If they are slowed, we can help them. If they scatter, we cannot." "It's well done," Jon said, and meant it. Tyrion gave the smallest of bows, almost invisible under his cloak. "And a few of the smartest old men in the north have been set to watch the stars," he said, "which they've been doing since before I was born. If they see the dead move in some way that confounds us, and I am prepared to be confounded, they'll ring those bells from the small sept with a pattern Ser Davos and I worked out. Something useful to do for men who can no longer hold a spear." Sansa's eyes flicked toward Jon's sword, then toward the dark. "Bran," she said, She meant the gods would. John felt that word in his chest like a blood thump. Theon is with him, John said. The name came out easier than it would have months ago, and that too felt like treason to his younger self. The Ironborn have fast hands with a bow when they're not stealing goats. They'll do. And Arya? Tyrion asked, as if he did not much want to hear the answer. Somewhere in the inner yard Gendry's hammer rang like a stubborn bell against metal. John glanced toward the sound. She has what she asked for, he said. She'll go where she thinks she ought. Tyrion's breath fogged. The most reassuring of reassurances. Sansa's gaze returned to John. And Daenerys? Ready to fly, John said. He had spoken to her in the Godswood at dusk, when the last of the red sun had caught the ice at the heart tree and turned it into something that looked like a blade. Dany had stood in that light like a woman raised to a pyre, and the red had set sparks in her hair. When he told her he did not want the Dothraki to ride into the dark, that he wanted them held in reserve, she had gone quiet. For a long time, "They will not like it," she had said at last, very softly, as if speaking to the roots themselves. They were born to meet the storm at a gallop. Let them live to see the day after, John had answered, and for a heartbeat she had looked at him as if she might spit fire. Now he held Sansa's gaze and felt the weight of what felt like 100 lives perched there like birds waiting to startle. When the trenches are lit, he said, voice low, we hold. We take them apart until they make us move. Not before. She will listen to you? Sansa asked. John did not know the answer to that. He knew the way Dany's hand had felt when she put it on his chest under the Godswood, as if she wanted to feel his heart's proof. He knew that when she had come to Winterfell, the North had looked at her like a winter apple, shiny but strange, with a taste no one trusted. He knew dragons were harder to tether than women, and that women who had mounted dragons were not often made soft by love. He knew what he had told her. We win here or none of the rest matters. If you burn yourself to take him, you give him what he wants. He knew she had listened, and that was not the same as obeying. Sansa had never liked the ways in which John stretched truth into hope. She said nothing, which was its own opinion. When she left, her hand trailed along the top of the stone parapet as if to remind it she belonged to it. Tyrion watched her go and then tipped his face up to the low sky. I've always wanted to be under siege, he said. I imagined there would be more wine. There will be if you live through, Ser Davos said. And none if you don't. Seems the same amount to me, one way or the other. The horn sounded once then, low and long. The sound went through John's bones like a memory. He turned his face into the wind, and the hairs at his nape lifted. Beyond the far line of torches a deeper darkness had formed. Not the shape of storm, but the shape of something with a mind. A weight moving over the snow that swallowed the snow's own light. Lovely, someone might have thought, in a nightmarish way, not John. The voice of the horn rolled away into the black, and the black answered. A whisper like distant cloth moving, thousands upon thousands of feet sweeping over snow. It sounded like a great house drawing breath at once. Ser Davos cursed softly and took a second lantern from the boy at his shoulder. Torches, John said. Ready the signal fires. Tell Grey Worm we hold. No heroics. Tell the Dothraki they live a day longer if they sit on their hands and hate us for it. Tell the archers to count. Every arrow counts. And tell the gods I'm sorry, Tyrion added, and gave John a thin smile that did not touch his eyes. Men ran. The wind took the first scream away and scattered it. It was too soon for a scream. John felt a shape press against his leg and looked down to see Ghost. He had come up the stairs like a shadow of snow, silent, eyes pale and intent. John put his palm on the great head and felt heat lift into his hand. For a moment the world narrowed to the dog's breath and the weight of his skull. Then the sound at the edges of the fields sharpened. The dead had found the first reach of stakes. They did not slam, not at first. They pressed. They came in a loose slither, a ripple too steady to be human. And then the line buckled and the front ranks folded, and those behind poured over them and into the sharpened wood. Some broke on the obsidian tips and hung jerking. Some tumbled onto the backs of those already pierced and dragged them farther down the stakes. and those bodies grew points of their own. The reach of the dead was not endless. Even the unnatural stumbles and pulls and crowds slowed in a thicket of sharp things. That was the plan. That plan did not know storms yet or kings with ice for brows. Men shouted. Women knocked arrows to strings. The first volley cut through the whiter shapes easily. The second had to seek. Light, Ser Davos told the red woman when she walked through the open gate with the snow fluttering around her like wet petals. She left no prints in the slush, though that may have been a trick of the eye. She laid one slim hand on the rough wood of the trench palisade and spoke as if she were telling a story to children. Her voice sounded not like warmth but like the memory of warmth. The rope frilled with oil took like kindling. A line of fire ran out over the white fields and drew a circle where there had been none. The wind grabbed at it, played with it, and in that brief play all who watched found themselves counted among one another as living. Not the Iraqs, Jon said to the Dothraki commanders. Men whose faces were long and fierce and closed as a winter mouth. Kono. He still wore that expression like a brand, even here in the cold. Bared his teeth as if he wanted to show Jon what they were for. Jon met that wolfish look and did not look away. Not yet. Ride the flanks when the fires die, he said. Not before. Khaleesi, Kono said, as if that one word made of all the rest a whisper. I've told her, Jon said. Drogon screamed overhead, and the fire along the trench jumped in response as if roused by Kin's cry. When the dead met the fire they burned. When they burned, they kept going because they did not mind pain and did not mind losing what they did not own. But many fell into the ditch and fed it, and more stumbled into their backs and fed it more, and the ring brightened to a brighter ugly light. Count, Jon murmured, though the archers at the wall knew their own craft. When a white skull split on the stone beneath the line of turrets, he did not cheer. When another found its knee with a bad step and turned that knee into splinters, he did not look away. If a thing was to be survived, it had to be seen. On the yard below, the Unsullied stood like ink strokes and did not move. The way Grey Worm lifted his hand and made it fall without hurry was almost gentle. When the first ladder of bodies tried to bridge the ditch, his hand lifted again and fell, and in the towers beyond the walls men thrust long poles with hooks toward the trench and pushed the ladder back. It folded on the flame, writhing. Ghost's lips peeled back from his teeth. Somewhere behind Jon, a child began to sob and was carried away by a woman who did not scold him. You scolded a child for spilling soup, not for weeping at the end of the world. The sky pressed lower. Jon felt the change not in his face but across his shoulders, as if hands had stepped out of the air and laid themselves there and grown cold. The light died in the space between one breath and the next. The wind that had been moving seemed to forget how for a time, and then remembered all at once and came back too strong. Snow thickened as if something exhaled it. In that whirling white a shape moved, then another, until the upper air was full of silent shadows as fat as barges, and always toward the heart of the walls, and always toward the place where the gods would stood like a thought no one could quite think. Jon turned his face up and parted his lips. He could taste cold like metal. He lifted his hand. Now, he said, and Ser Davos lifted his lantern and dropped it, and the signal fire roared up from the tower's iron basket. 3 more climbed up beyond it in quick succession, and answered on the other side of the yard, a relay thrown across roofs and rigging by boys barely taller than their torches. Drogon swooped, and his shadow tore the light in half. Then there was only light and heat and a sudden sear of melted snow steam as Dany drove him along the outer arc of the flames, bathing the dead beyond the trench in a rug of fire. Rhaegal followed close behind, not as pretty and not as pleased, his roar lower, his flame a deeper furnace orange that flickered like banked coals. Jon's hands found the saddle knots without thinking. When Rhaegal lifted, Jon lifted. The old fear and the new joy twined together in him until he could not tell them apart. The storm wanted to take his eyes, his breath, his grip. He gave the storm his anger instead and held on. They flew not like men chasing a deer but like men walking a wall, slow and steady, laying flame where flame would count, not where it would be seen. In the blue beyond they felt the other before they saw him. It was in the way the wind's note dropped, and in the way the snow eddied not randomly but in a spiral. Then Viserion came like a broken comet, the blue fire from his throat slicing the night into screaming ribbons. Dany banked and the white went white-hot and then plunged back to black like a lid dropped over a pot. Drogon bellowed. Rhaegal rolled, and Jon's body rolled with him and the world rolled under them. And the spiked frost below strobed with light and then with shadow. The scream of dragon against dragon is a sound a man can carry into his old age and wake to and never know sleep after. Jon tried not to think of riding Viserion's back as a boy might, clinging with bare knees, laughing because his brother was alive. That boy didn't exist. He tried not to think of how Viserion's eyes had once been gold in a black sky and were now the color of river ice when it takes a horse and leaves only a hole behind. He gripped and he turned and Rhaegal's shoulder rolled under his thighs and he saw Dany rise and fall like a breath, saw the Night King crest the storm as if mounted on it, the big spear lazy in his hand. He had the posture of a man at a window. Jon wanted to put his sword through that posture and feel it change to the posture of a falling thing. Still, he did what he had vowed to do. He did not abandon the sky road to arrow after the man like a dog after a cart. He held to the path they traced before the night began, and he burned the reach where the dead were densest and where the pitch had failed and where the ditch had piled too high with carbonized bodies to be a ditch any longer. Twice, in the white, he thought he felt the Night King's eyes on him like a cold palm pressed to his forehead, and twice he turned his face away as if to deny it. A third time he looked back and let the man see his own face, and Jon understood why some men grin with blood on their teeth. Something in him hardened not into ice but into a blade set in cold water until it could carry the cold and not break. On the wall, Ser Davos sent the second signal when the trenches died down and could not be relit. Blue fire chewing oil like a beast eats a bone and laughs at the marrow. Grey Worm set his men to the forward palisade. The Unsullied moved in files as neat as a seam and set their shields with a sound like a door shut on a family argument. The dead poured up and spent themselves on that line and fell and crawled and were stepped on by those behind, and when their blue eyes peered through the pattern of the shields, gray eyes met them without flinching, and the short spears, their black tips gleaming, rose and fell and rose and fell. Men in the rear rank kept their spears low to knock away hands and teeth. Men in the front did not watch the faces in front of them but watched the shoulder of the man to their right. You could not be surprised if you watched where the next hand would come. On the inner court, Brienne of Tarth stood shoulder to shoulder with Jaime Lannister under the left tower, and when a dead thing tumbled down between merlins and tried to drag a crossbowman by the ankle, she split its skull from ear to ear with a smooth, perfect blow. She heard Jaime laugh, not because anything was funny but because breathing sometimes sounds like laughter at the edge of the last breath. His gold hand had been wrapped in rough leather strips and sat heavy against the shield rim like a weight to anchor him. He lifted his good blade and found another neck and took it calm as a butcher, and beside him Podrick Payne sang under his breath, not for courage but because. The song had started and would not stop. The hound had found a place behind a stack of barrels and stared at the way flame crawled along oil and up rope and over men's hands and up into the air until he lost it trying to find it again. He had the look of a man who had left the yard behind and was standing in a place only he could see. Beric Dondarrion knelt beside him and did not take his eyes off the line of the wall where it began to buckle. "You run from fire," he said, "and you'll run to it. You always have. So run, but run where she is." The hound blinked. He licked his lips and tasted soot. "Who?" Beric did not point. He did not have to. Arya Stark moved along the shadows like a piece of shadow that had learned to hate. Her spear was in two parts now and her hands moved along its length with unconscious grace. She had chosen the places where the torchlight left no light at all, and she made those places into a map of her own. A white came over the wall with a sound like a sack tossed down, and she moved without looking. A down thrust, a flick, gone. Her face was as calm as sleep. Sandor stood up then and shook his shoulders as if water had rolled off of them. "7 bloody hells," he said, and went where his feet had wanted to go all along. It might have gone fast, in the old songs. A great cry, a great crash, a great silence. It did not go fast. It went with pauses and with effort and with bits. Men grew tired and then grew more tired, and then continued to place their feet as they trained to place them. Women knocked arrows until their fingers bled under the leather, and then they switched hands without thinking, and then they switched back because the right would not let the left remember what it had learned. A boy named Tom. No one had asked his last name and no one would remember it after. Killed 6 whites that he could tell and probably 3 more that he could not. And then he slipped on old blood on a stair and a dead woman's hand closed on his hair and pulled his head back as if to whisper to him. And Sir Brienne threw her shield like a man throws a dish at a hearth and took the woman's jaw off and then retrieved the shield and did not look at the boy to see whether he had lived. He had. For 2 more hours, which would matter to someone for 2 years and to no one after. Among the trees, snow sifted from branch to branch and made the gods would sound like rain. Bran sat in his chair with a blanket over his knees that he did not need and his hands folded the way a Septon folds his hands when he wants to pretend he is not angry. Theon stood in front of him with a bow in his hand and did not fidget. It would have been safer to fidget. It would have let him believe his hands had something better to do. He heard his men breathing. He heard something moving in the leaves beyond the fish pond. Just a weight slipping from one bed of fern to another. He drew and loosed and drew and loosed. His fingers had been raw before he started. They were not less raw now. "I'm sorry," he said once, without turning. Bran's eyes were on dreams and ravens. He smiled a little. "You're here," he said. Theon laughed once through his nose, quick and ugly. "Aye, that's the worst of it." A shape came through the snow as if shaped by it. Theon's arrow took it in the mouth. One beside him said something in the old tongue of Pike, the kind of blessing that makes its poor bones from a curse, and spat. Theon thought, idly, "I would like to see the sea again." Nothing more complicated than that, no big speech to himself, no long memory of boys who had laughed in halls too cold for laughter. Just a bit of sunlight on water, and his sister's voice cutting the wind like a sail's slap. The sound of trees moving drowned that wish. He drew and loosed and drew and loosed. Jon felt, during the 3rd pass along the walls, when the dragons' bellies were raw from heat and their throats rasped and the ice smoke stung like nettles in his eyes, that something under the world had changed its mind. The dead pressed and the living bent and did not break, and where the ditch failed the stakes took and where the stakes bowed the shovel's work had made the snow a kind of slowing swamp, and the Dothraki, loath though they were, rode the flanks like wolves, slashing and turning and slashing again and never outstripping their own breath. They were beautiful in the ugly way only men who have agreed not to die are beautiful. Jon's heart thudded at the sight of them, and he would have wanted to shout had air existed to be wasted on shouts. The Night King began to spend his gaze oddly. Jon felt him weighing. That gaze moved not along the wall but down into the town. It made no sense and made perfect sense at once. He's looking where we put the helpless, Jon thought. He wants to move us, not just kill us. At the small sept in the winter town, the men with their faces tilted to the sky had begun to ring their bells in the pattern Davos had taught. Low, low, high, pause, low. It sounded like a broken laugh. From the glass gardens the glow brightened and dimmed. The women inside had been told not to scream. Most didn't need to be told. The children had been given soft felt to chew if they needed to make a sound. Little Sam had fallen asleep with it half out of his mouth. Gilly had said shhh to no one but the air, and Sam had put a shaking hand on her knee, and it had stopped shaking in an instant. There was a thing beyond fright that made all the little things slow down and become manageable. The men along the inner trench watched the dark between buildings as if it had teeth, and it did. But oil burns there as well as out beyond the walls, and glass cuts where it is laid, and men with spears hold their ground even when they are not heroes. A groan rose from the ice and spread, like it was being carved from a huge stone. The trench froze, not all at once, not clean, but in a scum of pale ice that looked like fat hardened. On cold stew. It took more freezing and the weight of many bodies before it would bear. And then it bore. And the first ranks came across with their feet slapping and the next ranks came because there is no word for wait in the dead tongue. Grey Worm set his second line and did not lock eyes with the thing that had been a girl when it leaped at him. He put his spear through its skull and then took his spear back and wondered vaguely how he had learned to do that without thinking. How many years had it taken? He did not have the thought for long. The line swallowed the girl and kept swallowing. The hound took a blow on his arm that should have knocked him down and did not. Beric's flaming sword went out, which he had not seen happen in that way before, and he laughed once in surprise and then lifted it again when the red woman's voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once and put fire back on it like a woman putting bread back on a table when a child's hand has stolen it. The world turned, and the dead rose where they had fallen. It happened all at once, and it happened again and again. The men who had kept their feet when the first wave hit squinted through sweat against the sleet and saw the bodies twitching like fish flipped onto a dock and then pushing themselves up with a great slow push, the way a man gets off his knees when he has been praying too long, and then they stood. The archers on the towers saw their own dead men stand up and turn their faces toward the wall with an expression that was no expression at all, and too many men lost a breath on that sight, and too many of those men never saw their breath again. The ring of bells in the small sept took on a jagged edge. On Regal's back John felt that pulse ripple as a stag feels a nettle across its flank. In the yard, Jorah Mormont, who had been very sure he was already dead and therefore unkillable until morning, stopped feeling that sure and adjusted a strap on his sword hand and found his lady in the sky by her voice. Dany had thought herself tired and found that more tired exists. She used it like a whetstone and laid Drogon against the new edge until the decision was the only thing left. The sky broke. It was a simple thing. Viserion dropped out of the cloud with his blue fire, a wide net flung low. Drogon took the brunt of it along one shoulder and screamed and twisted, and Dany's head snapped back like a doll's head on a stick. Regal rolled. Jon felt the tendons in his forearms burn, and he gripped again, and not the same way. And Regal's wing carved up into Viserion's belly, and for a moment something that was once blood splashed the air like cold paint, and then the Night King and his mount were gone into the dark, and the taste of iron was in Jon's mouth like he had bitten it. He did not know why he grinned like a dog. But he did. The dead poured through the shattered gate in the south wall, not because there had been no men there, but because so many had fallen there, killing so many that there were holes where there had been men. They moved as a crooked river moves, around one obstruction and over another, and Jorah put himself where Dany would fall if she fell, and Gendry, who had meant to carry arrows and nothing more, found himself with a hammer in his hands and a memory of a girl's mouth on his, and he thought, "If I live I will not waste the day it buys," and brought the hammer down. Brienne's voice rose in an order that did not sound like an order, and Jaime's blade found a wrist and sent a hand flipping end over end toward a wall already covered in black streaks. "Back!" Grey Worm called in his own tongue, and then again in the common, and the formation hinged on itself like a door and retreated 10 paces. Then 10 more, shields still locked. The whites did not understand a hinge and smashed themselves against the place where the men were not this second, and then where they were the next. When the hinge shut, it shut on necks and arms and torsos that had no right being where they were, and the black points of the spears were surgical in the mess. "Hold, hold," Ser Davos said to no one in particular. "Hold your bloody water." There were tears frozen in his beard. In the winter town the first of the dead found the ring of glass and punctured itself upon it, and then many more followed because they knew nothing but following. The men with spears did not break their lines, though 3 of them thought of it, and one took a step and then stepped back because an old woman's thin hand reached out and gripped the back of his fur, and a voice said in his ear, plain as spring water, "Hold." Oil took. Flames rose along the smaller trench like girls running with their hair on fire. The screams there were human, because some of the dead had broken through where the rings met and the rings did not meet perfectly. But those screams were not the only sound. There were the sounds of spears in meat and glass in skin, and men who had been thought useless finding they were not. A boy who had slept curled under a table woke because of firelight and saw his mother's face orange and afraid and put his hands over his ears. He did not hear the dead come for him. He did not have to. A dyer with strong arms and a grave he had meant to dig in spring took his broad knife and made the motion he had made so many times cutting cloth, and found that cutting other things was not so different after all. Sansa stood on a crate in the middle of the glass houses and watched with the eyes of a woman who is counting her house 1 stone at a time. Men brought her news. She did not move her hands when they spoke. She did not move them when they stopped. Once she lifted one and placed it for a modest second on the top of Tyrion's head, the way a mother does when a child is too clever by half and needs grounding. He blinked up at her, surprised, and then turned away and shouted an instruction through cupped hands. She had not asked him to stay. He had stayed. She kept her eyes on the cracks along the panes where the heat met the cold and thought, absently, that if the glass gave they would be steam and bone and that would be that. She was not moved by that thought one way or the other. She sent a boy with a loud voice to the inner trench to tell the spearmen to step in when the dead fell back, not to push out when they came on. She could feel the difference between those on her skin. She could not have explained it if anyone had asked. Melisandre walked among them like a woman who had lived her whole life in snow and was bored by it. Whatever had lit her sword lit her eyes from within. She did not lay hands on any man. But when she passed him, some remembered a prayer they had forgotten, and some forgot one they had sworn. When the glass along one section bowed and wept water, she set her palm against it and closed her eyes and spoke a word no one but the glass heard. It held a little longer. "Jon!" Dany's voice cracked through the open air like a thrown plate. He turned regal at once. Drogon had driven the whites from a corner of the yard and then been swarmed in the next breath and gone to ground there, and the mass on him writhed like vermin on meat. His wing ripped a neat line along the roof of the armory. Dany clung and slashed, and her blade looked like a needle in a herrick. Yora crashed into the morass without no care for where a blade might be, and Grey Worm's formation split and took the edge of the swarm like a tide takes a bank and slaps at it. Jon did not think. Regal leapt, and the heat of his breath half-melted Drogon's attackers into a single thing that smoked and howled and then stopped howling. The smell would live under the stone for years. Dany looked up once in the soot and put a hand on her mouth in surprise like a girl. Jon saw that and felt a ridiculous, quick pang. For her and for himself. Then he saw the Night King on the far side of the yard, still as a nail driven into oak, watching. It takes a long time to move 30 paces through deep winter snow when your feet are not shod for it and every bit of air burns like ground glass. It takes less time if there is hate in you or something like it, and nothing else to share the space with it. Arya Stark made each step a separate decision. She learned long ago that when you send your body on alone, it will pick the worst path. The blue at the edges of her sight made the world seem farther away and closer at once. She kept her eyes on the godswood and the not quite dark between trunks. The heart tree's face looked too much like a man's now. Why had she never noticed that before? She had the weight of the dagger at her waist like a fact. She knew it before her hand knew it, and her hand knew it long before her mind did. Theon looked at her when she moved into the clearing, and his face did three things quickly. Fear, a kind of joy, and then something perfectly contained. He lifted his bow once more, and then the quiver was empty. When the White Walkers began to step through the trees like service at a wedding. Quiet, formal, inevitable. Theon's mouth flexed around a word no one heard. He did not run. He did not wait. He went forward, because there was no other direction. He had always been a man better at going forward than at stopping. "Thank you," Bran said, and his voice was a rope slipped off a post. The Night King moved like a man on a promenade. He carried the spear loosely, as if it were an instrument he might or might not play. The snow around him spun, as if it had remembered something it had been taught when the world was new. Theon's charge was not long, and it was not noble. He was too tired for either. He went the length of the pond, feet slipping and catching, and then he was simply there, and the spear was inside him, and he looked down surprised as if someone had offered him a plate and taken it away before he could decide whether he had wanted what was on it. His knees went. Arya took a breath and did not feel it. The Night King bent to pull the spear free with no ceremony, as a man pulls a weed. The trees were taller than Arya remembered. How could they be taller? As she ran, she felt the landscape underfoot like a practice dance. Roots here, a flat stone there, a cushion of needles that will swallow sound if you set your foot on the edge of it like so. The dead did not breathe, which made them loud. Their movements pressed the air in ways only the living could bear. She did not look where she looked, but she saw. She had thought of doing this before she had thought of how. She had taken the how apart and put it back together 100 times before that thought ever became a shape. She went where the Night King's eyes were not, which was nowhere. She went anyway. Jon saw none of it. He had turned regal in a tight curl and taken the yard in, and the shape in the grove drew him as a candle draws a moth and a moth draws fire. He did not move toward it. Everything in him moved there instead. It was a strain not to go. It was the greatest strain he had ever known, and he had known some. He held to what he had promised himself and to his strategy like a man holds a rope drawn through his flesh. He took the mass of whites off Drogon as best he could and then set Rhaegal's head down in a curve he had learned only tonight. Low, bite, lift. He did not think of Bran's face. He thought of the maybe that was a trap in all men. Maybe I can do what I most want to do. Maybe I can do two things at once. Maybe the world will let me have this. The Night King's hand went up slightly, as if he were smelling the air. Then Arya struck. He turned in time to see a blur. The air felt wrong, as if something had arrived without paying the tax of time. The dagger flashed and the hand that should have caught it did. But the hand that mattered had already let go. It was as if all the small things Arya had not done in her life in the last 2 years, had not eaten, had not slept, had not laughed too loud, had not drunk too much, had dressed in her skin and come along with her to do this one thing and then go away leaving her empty and too light. The blade kissed ice that was not ice, and something cracked that had not been born yet, and the cold in the yard deepened and then left like a guest called away. The Night King did not fall. It was worse than that. He drifted, as if his weight had been cancelled. He came apart like frost on a windowpane under a child's warm hand. He was there and then he was dust and then he was not. Jon felt something come back into him that had not ever belonged to him. Around him the whites stopped without drama, as if they had just remembered they were late for supper somewhere else, and then toppled. A spear clattered from a dead man's hand and sounded like every other spear on every other yard. Ordinary. A wind went over the walls like laughter that was not cruel. On the wall men cried out because there was nothing else to do. Some did not. The quiet fell. It had heft. The gods would held its breath. Theon's face had gone slack. His mouth had been saying something still when the world lost the cold will, and the word finished and was nothing, a thread cut. Arya stood and could not feel her feet. The heart tree watched in no way at all. Bran blinked and returned from a place that was more a time than a place, and put his hand on Theon's hair as if smoothing it would make any difference at all. It made none. Rhaegal landed badly in the yard and nearly went to his knees. Jon slid down and hit the ground hard enough to rattle his teeth. He stood anyway. He had to see. He had to see his brother in his chair in the trees and a girl with blood on her and a man he had despised and forgiven and given back a name. He ran and it was like running through a dream, where the place you go to does not get closer although you move, and then he was within the grove and he slowed because some places deserve a pace, and some people deserve an approach that asks permission. He stood a moment just inside the red boughs, and the sound of the yard behind him stormed his ears. Arya had sat down on the cold ground as if it had called her by name. Her face looked too young. The blood on her was not hers, mostly, and the bit that was looked too bright. Bran's eyes settled on Jon and were old again. Jon made the smallest sound and went to Theon first. He had not meant that. He had thought he would go to Arya or to Bran. He went to Theon. He put his hand on Theon's shoulder and felt the last little heat there the way a boy feels the last glow of a coal in an old fire when he rakes it over looking for a spark. "You were a good man," Jon said, and meant it completely, which would have shocked the boy he had once been more than the dragon had. He looked to Arya then and did not try to speak. Her mouth trembled once and then was firm again. She got to her feet without his hand. She did not need his hand. He did not offer it. He felt pride like pain. It would be tidy to say that after that there was only the counting. It was not tidy. There were screams and there were none, and then a man would find a body and it would be someone he had borrowed an axe from 5 days ago and he would fold down on himself like wet cloth, and then he would get up because there were more living than dead now and that has its own duty. The dragons lay in the yard like spent bellows and panted steam. When the steam thinned and became breath again proper, someone laughed and someone else answered it with a sob and someone else went and found a skin of water and poured it gently into a mouth that could barely swallow. Gendry sat down on a half-broken crate and put his hammer between his boots and set his hands on his thighs and looked at them as if just now learning they were his. Ghost shook himself and bayed once. A long note that lifted and fell and sat somewhere at the back of every throat that heard it. Melisandre took a breath that sounded like relief and pain combined and then began to walk toward the open gates as if she had an appointment in the dawn. Sansa came through the archway into the yard with her cloak around her and her eyes raking the scene. She had a streak of soot along one cheekbone that made her look younger. Tyrion kept pace at her side. He had blood to the elbow, but not much of it was his. The winter town had held. Many had not lived. Most had. It had been a plan. It had worked enough. Sansa climbed the steps to the wall and looked out. The fields were gray with the ash of what had been bodies made to move by something else. When the first light came up from the east, frames of black wood were all that cut the blank. The world looked like the hearth after a feast. Wreckage, embers, the odd interesting bone, the smell of something burned too far. It was not triumph, but it was not loss entire. The north had long languages for gradations of snow. It would need a few more for this. She turned and looked down into the yard and saw Jon in the Godswood and felt the new weight that had settled into the keep rise again. The living had a habit of turning their faces toward whoever had stood up when they could not. They do not ask if he had chosen to stand or had simply had his feet under him at the moment. They choose a focus because the eye wants it, because the heart wants it. People's eyes go where they need to go to keep from breaking. She knew this. She could feel it eating slowly at the allies they'd paid so much to buy. She had also watched the dragons cut the lines of the dead like sickles cut barley, and she had no interest in denying what she had seen because it did not suit a desired story. She was good at stories now. She was better at not letting them make her a fool. Down below, Dany slid from Drogon's shoulder to the ground with a little stagger she disguised as a step. Jorah was there, of course, and in that way he had of him. Making himself useful without saying, "Look at me." He had blood on his lips and none on his teeth, and when he smiled it was in apology to the day for having taken part in it. "My queen," he said. She put her hand on his face and held it there a moment, more than a moment. The look in her eyes was not the look she had given Jon when he had touched her before the fight. It had more of the world in it, and less of her in it, and more of a wound neither had a hand for. "Ser Jorah," she said. She had thought he would die for her again. He had not. She did not know what to do with that gift. She had never in her life received one she had not been meant to pay for eventually. She had no coin for it. "Rest," Jorah said. And that was a foolish word to say in a yard filled with screams and the crack of bones being set and dragons panting like dogs. But words do not need to be true to work. Grey Worm stood in the center of what had been a line and now was a coil of men and lifted his face to the pale day and then set his chin down and made the signal with 2 fingers for men to begin to gather their dead. Missandei came to him with a small cloth purse in her hand and her own blood dried along her knuckles. Sam came out of the glass houses with his arms full of blankets and looked around for someone to give them to and found there were fewer someones than there had been an hour ago. He had killed 2 things that had once been men and his body did not appear to have absorbed that fact. So he set the blankets down and went and threw up behind a broken apple cart, and then he wiped his mouth on his sleeve and went and sat with a man he did not know and held his hand while he died. He looked up once and saw Jon walking toward him across the yard with his hair knotted to ice and something new in his face. And he smiled in such relief that for a second everything became lighter than frost. "Sam," Jon said. "It was the name of a country." "You did it?" Sam said, and realized, with embarrassment, that it sounded like childish miracle-making. "We did," he corrected quickly, and then his face wobbled because the grammar was not the heart's problem at all. Jon squeezed his shoulder hard. "You lived," he said. "That's more than most men manage." "I hid," Sam said, and then wanted to take the words back, because he had thrown a spear that had missed and then had thrown himself into a tangle where the missing meant nothing, and he had not hidden at all. But once a man's mouth lets a lie escape that his fear believes, it's hard to fetch it back. "You're here," Jon said, as Bran had said to Theon, as if the words had been waiting all their lives to be used that way. Sam laughed a little at that and then wiped his nose with the back of his hand, disgusted by himself and also perversely proud. Melisandre reached the fallen bit of ground beyond the gate and stopped. She removed the heavy torque from her neck and let it fall into the snow with a muted thud. It sounded like a stone thrown into a deep well. She closed her eyes. The dawn hit her face like a decision carried through. She stood with a straightness that looked like it had been learned long ago and used little since. Davos watched her from the gate with a black expression on his face and did not move as she went. He had promised himself he would do a certain thing when the day came. He found he did not want to do it anymore. The day had been enough. When she fell the way a leaf does when it has finally let go after promising for weeks and weeks that it never would. She left behind only a dress and the steam of her breath rising from it for a few seconds longer than seemed possible. It was hours before the counting began in earnest. Hours more before the flames were stacked and the bodies laid in ranks and the words said, some right and some wrong and all heavy. In those hours, Sansa moved through the spaces as if she had been born in them and would die in them and walk them after. She saw to food being passed and to water and to finding someone to sit with a boy who would not speak and someone else to hold a girl who would not stop. She took a short rest not because she needed it, she did, but because others did, and men sometimes need to see that leaders will swallow what they must ask others to swallow. She sat on a low step and looked at her hands. They had the lines of her mother's there, if you knew how to read hands. Tyrion sat beside her and gave her a cup he had poured with the last of his flask. It was thin wine and tasted like something a man had lied about. I will admit, he said, that your plan with the glass and the greenhouses was better than hiding in a tomb with our ancestors. I hate being wrong. You don't hate it, she said. You love it when you can be taught. That makes me sound like a dog. You are more like a cat, but with a dog's loyalty somehow. She looked across the yard where Dany stood with her hand on a dragon's neck, her head bent. She is owed as much gratitude as any of us. I imagine, Tyrion said judiciously, that she would like to hear it from other mouths, and to hear other words. What words? She may like words that are not about gratitude at all, Tyrion said softly. She may like words about what comes after. Sansa watched Jon walking toward her then. He had a way of walking that made the ground look like it had been waiting for him. He moved as if his weight were a promise kept. He stopped and the three of them made the oddest of counsels. Jon's face had been set in concentration for so long it did not yet know how to come out of that shape. He looked at Dany a moment, then looked away. He looked at Sansa and did not look away. You were right, he said, about the crypts. The word is not right, when it keeps children breathing, she said. She saw the gratitude and the apology both move through his eyes like clouds. Still, thank you, he said. He had never looked younger or older. What now? Tyrion asked because it was the question and because he liked to be the man to put it on the table. He searched Jon's face for signs and saw too many. We burn our dead, Jon said. We feed the living. We sleep. We mend the walls. Then we march. He looked toward the south, and in that look Sansa saw something coalesce, the way frost does on glass. A pattern no one had intended and that you can still trace with a finger. South, Tyrion said mildly, to a queen who sent no men. She sent a man, Sansa said, and there was a small knife in it. You always did when we were children. I did not see it then. I did not, she said plainly. I thought very little of you then. I learned. She lifted her hand. I still am. She turned away. See that the pyres are even. It matters, she told Tyrion, who nodded as if she had told him that the sky needed holding up and he, busy man, would get to it as soon as he'd relaced his boots. Jon moved through the efforts of the day as men move through a dream. He lifted where it made sense to lift, and he answered where it made sense to answer, and he did not attend to the way men and women's faces turned after he passed to watch his leaving. Ghost followed him with a stride stiff from some strike he'd taken in the dark, and Jon bent once and rubbed the great head and felt the heat of him and the way his ribs lifted and fell like bellows. When he passed Dany he hesitated. She looked up and saw him hesitate and straightened without meaning to. A queen at once and a woman refusing to meet a man where he waited. Your plan, she said, was not the one I wanted. It was not the one I wanted either, Jon said. It was the one we had. It saved many, she said as if admitting a mistake was a thin bread and required a drink to get it down. It did, he said simply. And you were a fire, Daenerys. I've never seen its like. I hope never to see it again. She laughed once, surprised and not displeased. You hope to never see me at my best again. I hope there is never a need for your best again, he said, and found he meant it like a prayer. She looked at him carefully then, as if the skin of his face were a map with very small letters on it. What am I to them? She asked, and flicked her chin toward where Sansa crossed the yard and where Arya sat in the shade and cleaned the catspaw blade with a care that was another kind of prayer. Not to you. To them. Alive, he said. You are alive. You did not leave. This night will become a thing they say over bread for years. Your name will be in that saying. My name already is in many sayings, she said. Some of them are curses. It can be both, he said. The North is good at two things at once. She looked past him to where the Godswood's red leaves hung limp in the new light, and then back. And what am I to you? He might have spoken then of parentage and of names, dim with old history and sharp with new knives. He might have spoke of love, of fear, of duty. He might have told her he was too tired to know. He said, instead, a simple thing. You are someone I promised to stand beside. I keep promises. It sounded small when set against dragons and death. She closed her eyes briefly as if savoring the smallness like a taste on her tongue. I have not always kept mine, she said. I will try to keep the ones I make here, if I make any. She did not reach for him. He did not reach for her. The gap between them was not nothing, but it was not a chasm, either. It was a street a woman might cross if the weather held. When the fires took, they took like they liked their work. Jon stood with the rest and watched the smoke climb and made himself remember each face he could. The wind shifted and the heat licked his own face, and he thought absurdly of summer days working on the roofs at Castle Black. Tar thick and sweet. The sun so fat you could have cut slices off it. He had been a boy then. He would never be again. The smell of the dead was not a thing a man could carry and remain a boy. Ed had fallen early. Ed had fallen with his usual complaint on his lips. And when they put his body onto the pyre, Jon had felt the unfairness like a hand on the back of his neck. Lyanna Mormont was so small in death that it hardly made sense that a giant had given her to them. They spoke her name like a roar, and it sounded like a whisper anyway. And both were right. Theon's body lay with the stark dead, an oddness that no one argued with. A small girl in the crowd would later tell another small girl that the Ironborn prince had died with a smile on his face. He had not. He had died with his mouth half open as if to say something, and perhaps that was the same thing to children who, with reason, think most words are useless. When night came again, it came clearer than the one before had, and the stars seemed relieved to be allowed through. Men slept where they fell. Some did not sleep and would not now for a long time, finding in their eyes little white flashes when they shut them. Women lay side by side on the ground, their hands linked, not lovers but comrades. In the kitchens, someone had found onions that had not rotted. Someone else had found fat in a jar. A third had found dried strips of meat that had smelled more like leather than food and had been transformed in the pot into something men sopped bread in and did not ask its name. Tormund fell asleep with his mouth open and a bone still in his hand. Gendry woke with a start when someone tripped over his foot and then laughed at himself for waking like a girl, and then slept again with his mouth wet and his hand where it had wanted to be when he fell, on the haft of his hammer, because he had told himself he would not sleep with anything else again until the living were truly living. Arya slept in a balcony above the yard, and once she woke and thought she saw Syrio Farrell's face in the scudding clouds, and then laughed soundlessly at herself and slept again, treated by her body as a child is treated when it is too tired to be in charge of itself. At dawn, Jon went to the Godswood alone. The cold had become a person in the last days. You greeted him when you stepped out, you learned his moods and his tells. Today he had gone west to bother the big trees there. It was not warm, but the air did not have the wet edge to it that had sung in his ears last night. The leaves of the heart tree were sticky under his fingers, as if the tree had been crying. Bran waited with his chair turned so he could watch the pond. It had a bit of ice on it, the thin spring ice that is more mirror than sheet. You saw, Jon said. I saw the birds, Bran said. I saw the river of them. I saw one fish. Men like rivers and birds. They are not very good with fish. Jon smiled despite himself. You saw more than that. Bran's eyes lifted to his face and saw too much. You did what you said you would do. You held. It mattered. I did nothing alone, Jon said, because that line had become the drumbeat in his mind. It made it so he could imagine sleeping. Arya. Yes, Bran said. Arya. He looked back at the pond and the thin sheet that would not survive a thrown stone. I once told you that you were a Stark and a Snow. You are more than both now. The truth is a net, Jon said slowly. Some days it catches fish. Some days it catches the man who threw it. It will not today, Bran said. Today the truth will stay where it is and look at you. Another day it will do something else. It would be easier if it would be kind. Jon's breath fogged and thinned. Sansa thinks we must build more than pyres. She'll have a town full of people to tell me I was wrong if I don't listen. Daenerys thinks we must move before the South grows comfortable in our grief. Both are right, Bran said. That is the trick of it. Most days both men at the table are right. Most women too. And you? I am not at the table, Bran said. I am the table. He did not smile. Go where you must. But go like a river, not like a bird. Let the banks hold you to the shape that suits the land. Jon looked at the face carved in the heart tree and thought it had been carved with less care than his own heart had been. He put his palm flat against the bark. It was like skin that had survived fire. He exhaled and went back to the yard. The next days were the kind where a man can forget who he is under the pile of what he must do. Repairs that would have been done in summer when the light was fat were done under thin light by men whose bones complained. Trench lines were dug again deeper and with better drainage. Stakes were bound with more glass and with a long spit twisted into their tips for good measure. The Dothraki curried their horses as if apologizing. The Unsullied oiled every bit of their gear with the focus of men convinced by the night that their own lives had value not just as a contest between kings but as a thing in the hands they used every day. In the glass garden someone had planted seeds because someone always planted seeds, as if the ground would be so grateful for the care that it would rush the season out of gratitude. Sansa organized levies as if she had been born a steward. In truth, she had been born a lady, and that is only sometimes so different. She wrote notes to the mountain clans and to White Harbor and to the dusty men who kept their boats righted on the shivering sea. She half wished for her mother's hand and then did not. What would Catelyn have done but the same? Sansa had no time for ghosts that wanted to be helpful. The only ghosts that were permitted were those who wanted to be burned. Dany spent hours with Drogon on the old parade ground while the men and women shook their heads and watched from a polite distance. She had flown until her thighs ached and her eyes felt rubbed raw, and now she trained the beasts on the ground like giant, resentful hounds. She had never had reason to force them to learn the routine that would keep them alive, and though dragons love nothing so much as reminding the world that it cannot teach them anything they do not already know, they were not fools. Drogon learned quickly to keep his heavy head lower than he preferred when hauling men from a crush, to blow short gouts, not long, when living flesh was too close, to sweep with a wing and not with his tail when the sweep must be wide and not killing, only moving. Rhaegal healed as beasts heal, which is to say, with no self-pity and straight through. Jon did n. Oti fly. He sharpened Longclaw and the unsung knives men used to cut bread and rope and sinew and shared what he had learned about making steel remember what it is for, which is not to glow on a lord's hip. Arya practiced with her spear until the wood in her hands felt more like bone than like wood. She practiced with the dagger until its weight grew smaller than the weight of the memory of it in the Night King's chest. Gendry tried to kiss her in the shade of a stair, and she let him once and then stepped back and looked at him with a warmth that did not belong to a girl his age and said, "Not yet." And he nodded and bit his smile and walked away to pound out nails that would hold the palisade stronger under pitch. She went and stood with Sansa over the lists of names and pointed out one or two where the spelling had hidden a second person inside a first. It mattered that they were counted as themselves. Tyrion sat with Bran for an hour a day and listened to things that were not stories but that bent the habit of a mind to something like wondering. Once, late in the evening, he said to Jaime, "He does not remember to be cruel. When a man has forgotten to be cruel, he has also forgotten part of how to be kind, peaceful, and disquieting as a well at night. Jamie, who had held Brienne's hand for a moment too long when she had laughed at something Pod had failed to do gracefully, said, "Is it a luxury to worry about peace? Or is it the only thing we can afford?" "Ask me in a year," Tyrion said. "Or later this afternoon. Lately my opinions change with the angle of the sun." When the first ravens came with news that men and women in the south were gathering in rooms, heated by coal and speaking of how the cold had receded and the threat had passed, Sansa smiled without humor. "Good," she said to the room of gathered counselors. "Let them say that. Let them be comfortable. Let them forget the weight of breath. Men with soft hands make mistakes we can collect like eggs. Or like heads." Dany's lips pressed. "I do not want eggs," she said. "I want knees." "You may get both," Tyrion offered, "because humor's only reason for being is to be offered where it is least appropriate." Jon tapped a finger against the plank table thoughtfully. It was not a lordly gesture. It was a blacksmith's. "We go in 10 days, he said. "If the weather holds. Longer if it doesn't. We go with all we can move without leaving these people naked." He looked to Sansa and to Dany both in the same glance. He felt something tear and then reknit inside himself, and it felt like growth and like hurt. "Sansa keeps the north. Daenerys flies with me. Tyrion, you go south of south to speak to anyone who thinks they might wish to be on the side of the day when the morning comes." "Grey Worm. The unsullied march," Grey Worm said before Jon could ask. His voice had no strain in it, and it had some. "They do not like to sit. They'll sit when they must," Missandei said, soft enough to be kind and firm enough to be true. "They will step when the time comes. Until then they will sleep and eat and keep their feet off the frost when they can." "And the Dothraki?" Jon asked. Kono lifted his chin. "We ride. We will not ride into night. We will ride at dawn and at noon and at dusk. The dead do not stand to meet you. Men do. Men break." He smiled, and it did not make him look kinder. That was not what smiles are always for. "You will have to want to live for longer than a day," Dany said to him not unkindly, and the odd, small look that passed between them was a kind of treaty. The room exhaled in something near agreement. That, in itself, was a kind of miracle worth noting. Outside, the sky had gone that odd pale the north knows 2 hours before snow and sometimes 2 days, and the air under the great hall roof smelled of men's mouths and wool and damp dishes. It smelled like a place that might not fall. The 10 days passed in the work of readiness and the tightened mouths of those who would not go. Men carved little animals for their children and tucked them into pockets. Women cut their hair shorter with sharp knives so it would not freeze to their lips if they lay on the ground to hide and breathe through wool. Grandfathers told stories, and some were true. A woman who had lost her fiancé sent a boy with a note to a man she had been unkind to last summer, telling him he had been right about the placement of the new sheepfold. The boy never found the man. He told the woman later, and she said, "He knows." And the boy nodded solemnly, because that is the kind of sentence children like to hear. It makes the world seem less cruel and more like a riddle with an answer. When the day came to go, Winterfell looked like a lung drawing in and holding. The column mounted in a slow clatter. Jon walked the length of it once and then twice, checking the harness on the wagons, the water skins, the barrels, the quiet faces of men who knew they were going to where the decisions would be demanded of them not as ideas but as acts. He found Davos counting under his breath and added his numbers to the older man's without speaking. Dany's dragon shadow crossed him once and then again as she conditioned herself to the pattern they would keep on the road. Low and then high and then low again, never where arrows had already leaned their attention. Sansa stood on the wall with no tears. When Jon drew near, she put her hand up once in a gesture that might have been blessing and might have been a command. He took it for both and then took the road. It was a long road, and not only in miles. Men learned to sleep on it and learned to love again on it and learned to wish for small things more than large. The north gave way to country that had not learned directly about the dead and had only been talked to by messengers about death. A butcher in a town with a low wall shouted that they were saviors when the column passed and then went back inside to cut fat Fr. Oem a haunch and tell his daughter that maybe they could keep the good lamp for the room this winter. A woman at a stream looked up from washing her child's shirt and was surprised by the dragon passing and then not surprised. People learned to normalize anything they must to go on. Men who had never fought heard the rhythm of boots and learned it by heart without choosing to. John felt the way the world had softened underfoot and hardened at once. He had never been a man of grand thoughts. He felt a grand thought rise in him anyway as the heat came up from the south and made the breath feel the weight of itself. All this, might be for something as ridiculous as a chair made out of swords men had dropped when they fell, or it might be for something as quiet as breath taken easily on a spring morning by a child with a bowl of porridge and no notion of what brink he had been brought back from. At night, when the fires were small and men's voices lower still, he spoke with Dany about what a day looks like when it can be given to people to fill it. He spoke with Tyrion about what a bargain looks like when both parties do not trust one another and should not. He spoke with Ghost without speaking and heard his own bones answer. When finally the sea came to lean on their left and the air tasted faintly of salt and the lights of men's greed pricked the dark where King's Landing squatted, they did not rush. They built the same sort of rings they had built in the north. Not of glass now but of stakes and trenches and thought. They received envoys who wore silk and pity on their faces and did sums in their heads behind their eyes. They made their speeches and wrote their names neatly on pledges that would burn easily if someone set a candle under them. They prepared siege engines without saying the word siege, and baking bread without saying the word hunger. The city watched and licked its teeth. They would in time be called to choose between roaring and speaking softly and between burning and building. But for a handful of nights under a sky that was steady and a wind that did not shove its hand under your clothes and wring your skin, they rested. John lay on his back and looked at stars that had watched kings before and had not grown bored. He thought of the moment at the wall at Winterfell when the dead had hit like a tide, and of how something in him had pulled against an animal hungering to sprint toward what he loved and he had not let it. He was not sure if that was courage or cowardice or both. He thought of Theon's feet in the snow. He raised a hand to the sky and could not see it for a second and then did. He slept and woke as men do when they've made peace with nothing and everything. Back in the north, the glass gardens were warm, earlier than they should have been. Children ran the rows and played a game with seeds where you had to count and you had to think about where you would be when the counting ended. Sansa looked at the ledgers and turned a page and thought of a story she'd once been told about a prince who slept 100 years and woke to find his kingdom changed. She did not want that for her brother. She did not want it for herself. She wanted no one to sleep through what they were owed. She stood and crossed the yard with her cloak open to the thin sun. The wind came around the corner of the hall and found her face. It was not a kind wind. It was honest. She turned into it and walked down to the road where a boy was learning to wheel a cart without tipping it and a girl was showing him, because girls can, and the world did not feel poised to break so much as ready to bend. And if it would not bend, then it would be cut. She had learned to sharpen as well as any man at any forge. She smiled a little and did not apologize to any of the long line of dead women behind her. The day had been held once. Could be held again if held differently. That was the only bargain worth making, with the morning and with yourself. In King's Landing, bells that had not yet rung tolled half-heartedly in dreams of men who could not imagine why they would ever toll in earnest. The armies of the living settled like weight around the city's belly. The sea rolled its light in the distance like a thought returning. Tyrion sat on a crate and drew a map on the dirt not because maps are accurate but because they give the mind shapes to move along. Dany watched the city with her jaw align and her hands a little set. Jon stood with his back to both and his face to the east where somewhere the sun made its slow promises to men who would not cash them exactly. He thought of a night of white and blue and red and of a ring of fire that had been a choice and of a door he had kept closed. He thought of how keeping it closed had cost and saved and would cost and save again. He had not led the living out of the crypts so that they could bury themselves in a different tomb farther south. He had led them out because the long cruel will had been broken in the Godswood by a girl's hand and a man's faith in her running feet, and because that meant there was not an unanswerable force in the world anymore, only the answerable ones. He had learned in the snow that day that you cannot trap what you fear by huddling down into it. You meet it with open eyes and open ground and the right sort of kindness like steel. When the bells would ring, if they rang, he hoped he would remember that and hoped the others would too. He had hope because he had seen winter break under a small knife and a body's pivot in the air, because small things and long patience make cracks that topple walls. For now, he closed his eyes and breathed. The air was thick with humans here. Their cook fires, their latrines, their breath, their arguments, their proposed betrayals, their earnest, foolish loves. It was an air that could be shared. He opened his eyes. He went to find Davos to discuss bread and timber and the mood of the city, and